Hey guys, it's Mike here, and in this video, I'm going to be reviewing Ahsoka Season 1, which just wrapped up its first season over on Disney+. This is the Star Wars series that is being led and directed by Dave Filoni, the creator of the Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels, and features Ahsoka, the one-time apprentice of Anakin Skywalker, Darth Vader himself, and her journey to try and prevent the return of Grand Admiral Thrawn back to the galaxy after the events of Star Wars Rebels, as well as trying to find Ezra, who also disappeared alongside Thrawn, being the main character of Star Wars Rebels, and that much more along the way. Now, going into this series, my expectations weren't exactly high, to be honest. At this point in Disney Star Wars, I've been let down so many times ever since they acquired the rights to Lucas's overall great franchise of Star Wars. Be it the sequel trilogy, which ended up becoming terrible over time. You can even say from the very first episode of number 7 for a lot of hardcore Star Wars fans. Some of what happened in Rebels and the Clone Wars wasn't quite up to the heights of what came before, although at least with Clone Wars, I do feel like it finished in a great way, with Dave Filoni clearly putting a lot of effort into that, with, of course, Ahsoka being the character he created and somebody he always wanted to present in a strong way that you could see the kind of passion coming from him with regard to that. And so going into this, you had that aspect, but then you also had all the failures of Disney Star Wars, whether it be with Obi-Wan Kenobi, the show, which for me just was not good at all, and then of course with the Mandalorian Season 3, which was a massive letdown after Season 2's awesome season and finale. And of course, the less we talk about the Book of Boba Fett, the better. I don't feel like writing anything like a bantha. But with that being said, going into this series, it was one that I was hoping would be good, because as a lifelong Star Wars fan, I am someone who wants this to be turned around. I'm someone, unlike many of the other people out there, who does not want everything to crash and burn and to, just be set ablaze and then to move on and work on other things. I want something that I've had this emotional attachment to and see the intrinsic value within to be great. And so I had hopes for Ahsoka, even though it might not have been necessarily a new hope. But nonetheless, going into this show and coming out of it, my first impression before I get into the deep dive of the review is that I liked it. I thought it was actually really good overall, although it definitely has its strengths and weaknesses, which I'll be breaking down in this video. But before I begin, if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and enabling all notifications. That way you can stay up to date with all my future videos. Additionally, make sure to leave a like, share your own thoughts down below. I'd love to read them in the comments, and share this video out. All of that together will allow us to continue to grow strong with the Force and hopefully not go down the dark side path, even though they do have cookies. But with that being said, guys, let's get into this review. So in terms of Ahsoka, as I mentioned before, it was created by Dave Filoni and starring Rosario Dawson as Ahsoka Tano herself. And we had seen Rosario play Ahsoka in the other adaptations of her character thus far in Mandalorian and, the other little bits that we saw along the way. Honestly, I feel like for the most part, with regard to Ahsoka's performance portrayed by Rosario Dawson in this show, it was not quite up to the levels of what we had seen before, for whatever reason. Now, we've seen Rosario give some really strong performances in the past in certain movies that she's been in, and I thought that she did a really good job in the previous entries into the franchise where she played Ahsoka. But for the majority of this show, she's really stoic. She's not showing emotion. She's kind of just like almost sleepwalking her way through it. And for the first so many episodes of the series, this does make sense with what they convey to us in the story. Ahsoka's character at this point is really someone who is, tortured by her past. She suffered everything throughout the course of the Clone Wars, seeing her master fall, the fall of the Empire and the death of her master, and everything at this point, which she in many ways feels responsible for. And so as a result, I can can definitely understand her being conflicted. However, around the halfway point of the series, maybe a little bit after that, Ahsoka does go through a transformation, essentially becomes Ahsoka the White. You know, she pulls her own Gandalf when she goes to the world between worlds and meets with Anakin Skywalker at that point in time. And, you know, that for me is really the peak of this series thus far in terms of episode 5, where maybe it's the best thing that they've put out in Disney Star Wars in general, where we see the fight between Ahsoka and Anakin, where we see flashbacks to a live action version of the Clone Wars, where ironically the younger version of Ahsoka, played by the same actress who played young Gamora in Infinity War, honestly was a better Ahsoka on screen and more embodied the character than Rosario Dawson does in the show, because even though she goes through that overall transformation and she becomes a little bit more lighthearted and jovial and everything like that, she still is delivering things mostly in kind of a flat way. And that's the case for most of the actors in the show, not all of them for sure, which I'll get into soon. But for me, it feels like whoever was doing the direction of the actors was not necessarily up to par with the other aspects of the series in terms of the technicality, the effects, the cinematography, and direction of just about everything else. Either that or Rosario Dawson was just really stoned every time she was making one of these episodes. Either way, I think that she was serviceable and okay in the role, but definitely could have given a better performance, and I hope that we get a better one with her returning in the future. Another one of the main characters is Sabine Wren, who is one of the main characters from Rebels, and one of the things you'll notice throughout the course of this is I'm going to continue to mention Rebels characters because this show is basically just a live action continuation of what we saw in the Clone Wars to an extent, and definitely in Star Wars Rebels. Pretty much the entire main cast from Star Wars Rebels returns, with the exception of Zeb and, you know, also Kanan, of course, because he's dead at this point. But we do have Sabine as one of the focal characters, and for me, her character in the show doesn't really work that well, to be honest. Like, her first introduction where we see her on the speeder bike was honestly kind of cringe. She was listening to some weird punk rock music that apparently exists within the Star Wars universe, and she's like, I'm not gonna do what you tell me. She's acting like she's a rebellious teenager, even though I'm pretty sure she's a lot older than that in this point in the story. And we saw her whole character development going through Star Wars Rebels, to where this version of her doesn't necessarily feel one-to-one with that. Additionally, one of the things they do is they have Sabine once again taking up the training to become a Jedi, learn how to use the Force, and learn how to use a lightsaber, but she's honestly portrayed as being basically incompetent, which it seems like it's actually a massive overcorrection with regard to Sabine versus what we saw with Rey. Because in the Star Wars sequel trilogy, most fans did not like the portrayal of Rey as the ultimate Mary Sue, who basically is better than everyone without any real training and is able to beat Luke Skywalker in a fight and a million other things she does on screen, which is just ridiculous, and making her basically seem like almost a perfect character because she is that self-insert character that's meant to represent the politics of the people behind Star Wars rather than actually being a good, compelling character on her own. And so Sabine seems like it's basically that Lucasfilm, and at least Dave Filoni, became really self-aware of this, and as a result decided to, well, let's make Sabine less competent than Rey. And so as a result, during her fight, she's constantly taking hits. She gets shot like a million times, which none of them really do any serious damage to her. And she just can't, she barely uses the Force up until the season finale, where she finally gets to use it, but then they go a little bit too far with some ridiculous things, like her Force pushing another character that I'll get into soon, when we actually see behind her right here in midair, which basically was like him double jumping like in Super Smash Brothers or something. But either way, you know, there are certain things with Sabine that you could call out as plot armor for sure. There's many times where she realistically should have died and didn't because, you know, they want her to stay in the show. And one of the times is where they basically pull the same thing that they did in Obi-Wan with the character there, where Sabine is stabbed through by a lightsaber, by a far more interesting female lightsaber wielder in the show that I'll get into soon, and somehow Sabine survived and then returned. If only they had Oscar Isaac to say that in the show, even though I'm guessing he's like 12 at this point in the timeline. But speaking of the character that stabs Sabine, one of the best new characters who's introduced to the series would have to be Shinhadi. Shin Baddie, as a lot of people like to call her, which automatically became a fan favorite because she's kind of like a dark or gray Jedi who is using the dark side of the Force, wielding a red lightsaber, which, is caused when you bleed a kyber crystal and make it, basically in agony when you're using the lightsaber. And essentially, she is a character that's way more interesting, way more dynamic than, with regard to Sabine and many of the other characters in the show. And as a result, when we see her on screen, when we see her character developing, when we're learning more about her motivations, we're infinitely more interested in that than we ever are in anything that Sabine is doing. And even though come the end of the series, they don't exactly give it a finite conclusion where she's going and what she's doing, there is certainly more left open to explore with her, which I'm looking forward to, even though I do wish that she and her master had stayed together longer in the show so we can get more of that duo companionship character building that we were seeing before. And on the topic of her master, it was Balin Skull, who is my favorite character in this show by far, played by the late great Ray Stevenson, who also had awesome performances such as the Punisher in Punisher Warzone, which is basically the only good part of that movie for the most part. And so as a result, he plays a character who is very much like a Count Dooku, someone who used to be a Jedi general back before the fall of the Republic and the Jedi Order, who knew Anakin Skywalker, who was aware of his apprentice Ahsoka, and also who basically became disenfranchised with the Jedi Order. He saw them as essentially bound to fail, and as a result, he also started to witness and realize the recurring cycle of the rise and fall of the Jedi and of the Galactic Empire and everything else along those lines, which ultimately led him to seek something more. So all throughout the course of the show, we could see that there's more conflict within him than a typical mustache-twirling evil character like we could see in Star Wars. That's why he's very similar to a Count Dooku, to where he clearly has respect for the Jedi. He doesn't want to kill Ahsoka or any of the other Jedi, even though he certainly tries his best at points. And as a result, we could see that he clearly is aiming for something better beyond the goals of Morgan Ellsbeth, which I'll get into soon, as well as the other main villain of this series, who is set up in a big way come the end. And with regard to Ray Stevenson, it is unfortunate that he passed away during this, because not only is he the best character on the show, but additionally also they were setting up some really big things to come with him, seeing this other sort of dark side entity or figure or whatever it is that's calling him to this other planet that they go to in the other galaxy, and where at the very end of the show, he doesn't actually get killed off, but is rather set up to find whatever they're doing. They basically pull a Lord of the Rings at the end, where he sees off in the distance something there, while just so happening to also stand in the hand of the father from the children or the gods of Mortis. And so that for me is the best part of this season for sure, along with everything we see with the Clone Wars flashback, with Anakin, with Ahsoka. And it's a big part because of the great performance that Ray Stevenson gives here, as well as the physicality he brings, because not only is he a large man, but when he's fighting in the lightsaber battles, you definitely get a feeling that, he clearly can handle himself. And I think for the most part, the lightsaber battles are handled well. Not every single one of them is great or amazing, especially the ones with Sabine. Some of them can kind of come off as a little awkward or just fake, but there are certain lightsaber battles like the first one where we get with Ahsoka versus Balin, where they're shifting their stances and it's more like a samurai or knight battle. And then of course the final battle between Ahsoka and Morgan Elsbeth, who has been basically powered up by the Night Sisters and given their dark sorcery powers, as well as like a cursed blade. It feels like something straight out of Soul Calibur, where of course the Star Wars characters have been in the past. And we see that awesome fight, which is definitely the best one in the series for me, and one of the best ones we've seen since the bring into Disney of Star Wars. And so as a result, the action for the most part, if you're looking for fun lightsaber battles and good action, I think you're definitely going to enjoy this season as a result of that. Definitely better than some of the battles we've seen, like for example, the one in the throne room in the Last Jedi, where, you know, characters are basically just waiting to stab Rey. Although, let's be honest, like there are certain scenes in the show that are a little, I guess, nonsensical with regard to the fight, like especially later on when they start to resurrect with the dark sorcery, the stormtroopers, the death troopers or zombie troopers, whatever you want to call them, and like the characters are cutting them down, but they're not exactly decapitating them or anything that would necessarily make it where they can't come back. But, you know, there's a lot of little nitpicks you could definitely make about this show along the way with the action and basically everything else. The storytelling, why are the characters doing this? Why is Hera bringing her young son with her on horribly dangerous missions? And the list goes on. In terms of Hera Syndulla, played by Mary Elizabeth Winstead, I think she also does a really good job here. At first, when I saw her, I was kind of like, this is going to be interesting to see them trying to adapt like a character like Hera, a Twi'lek, as a main character. And I wasn't quite sure if Mary Elizabeth Winstead necessarily was the perfect casting for her. But overall, as the season went on, I do think that she did a really good job in the role, and I could see her putting out even better performances and being a bigger part of the story as it goes on. For the most part, Hera is kind of relegated to the background in this, even though she was one of the focal characters of Rebels, so I could see people not being a fan of that. And so as a result, you know, she's basically trying to prevent the return of Thrawn, even though the New Galactic Republic is basically doing their best to interfere with her at every point. They're like, oh, you shouldn't go to this planet, you shouldn't do this, we're not going to give you authorization, we're not going to give you TIE fighters and troops and stuff to stop this, you're just making stuff up, you just want to bring Ezra back. And, you know, I've seen some people complain about that on the internet, like, well, Hera was in the wrong, she was disobeying the government. It's like, well, yeah, the government's wrong about a million things in real life, and they're definitely wrong about things in this show too, because it's kind of obvious if you're paying attention and you understand how the narrative goes that Hera is right the entire time, and she inevitably gets bailed out essentially by Leia Organa when she sends in a cameo from C-3PO in order to kind of help Hera to get out of being, you know, kicked out of the Galactic Republic's military, essentially, and, you know, a dishonorable discharge for the most part. So, you know, I feel like they could have done more with Hera. They do explore things with her and her son Jason, who seems like he's kind of filling the role of Jason Solo, perhaps, from the Heir of the Empire and the extended expanded universe. And really, a lot of the things we see in the series is basically like another take and inspired by things from the EU, but of course going in its own direction, because naturally you can't exactly have a one-to-one interpretation in the EU at this point, considering how Disney has already changed so many things and essentially rendered the EU as legends or non-canon to the current continuity, much like what they do with the MCU. But, you know, certain fans will make the argument that they go much further than that with the changes. And on the topic of one of the greatest characters from the EU and a recurring villain in Disney Star Wars Rebels and now in Ahsoka, we have the return of Grand Admiral Thrawn, played by Lars Mikkelsen. And Lars does an awesome job. He's the brother of Mads Mikkelsen, and acting talent clearly runs in the family, because Lars, I think, does a great job on screen of embodying Thrawn, and he also did the voice in the Star Wars Rebels show. So that's one of the one-to-one things I do really like that Disney and Dave Filoni's following up on, even though not every character was portrayed by their voice actor in the show. We do get Lars coming in and giving a great performance as Thrawn from what we could see. In terms of Thrawn overall, you can make an argument that he doesn't necessarily appear quite as competent as he did in the, you know, Heir to the Empire series, or of course, even in Star Wars Rebels at points. There are a lot of times where, you know, his different contingency plans are foiled throughout the course of the show, and he doesn't necessarily get away with everything quite, you know, squeaky clean, let's say. But come the end, he does essentially win. He gets to escape the galaxy that he's trapped in with his cargo that hasn't been revealed yet, with the Night Sisters, and they're on their way to Dathomir, which is really interesting because it sets up a lot of things to come, perhaps, because in the show they set up a lot of things. Like, for example, they brought back the world between worlds. They can now do resurrections. They have the Night Sisters that came from the original Dathomiri homeworld in the other galaxy to Dathomir, which leads you to think that there's some big things that are going to happen with Thrawn, with them, and everything else on Dathomir. And not just that, but who's a major character from the Clone Wars and Rebels that came from Dathomir that was also brought back once before with the Dathomiri magic from the Night Sisters? Well, Darth Maul, the same one who used to be the main villain of the trilogy that George Lucas planned for the sequels that Disney threw away stupidly and created their own sequel trilogy, which ended up being trash. So I'm really interested to see more of what they do with Thrawn, even though you could say that he wasn't necessarily as badass, I guess, as he has been in other depictions in the past. He still had a really good portrayal by Lars Mikkelsen here and was one of the highlights of the show for me every time he was on screen. Now, we also had the return of Ezra Bridger in this show, who was portrayed by Iman Asfadi, and overall I think he did a fine job as Ezra. The thing is, he doesn't necessarily feel like Ezra to me, at least at first, as he's introduced. And really his introduction where Sabine finally finds him, after basically Sabine is the one that caused everything to happen because she refused to give up on her attachment to Ezra and wanting to find him and save him and bring him back to the galaxy, and thus in turn basically made a deal with the devil to lead to that happening. But by the time that Ezra is actually introduced, the introduction itself is a little underwhelming, where he's just kind of standing there like, hey Sabine, how's it going? And there's no like huge sweeping music. It's not like a massive heartfelt moment, which is more along the lines of, I guess, what we get with him and Hera at the end of the season. And not just that, but also, you know, like he has a totally different look from before. He basically looks like, I don't know, Moses or Jesus or somebody, you know, from the Bible, with his robes, with his beard and long hair and stuff like that. And so, you know, he seems like a different character, but he did grow on me more as the show went along. He got to have more action with the lightsaber eventually that he constructed using his old master's hilt, and a lot of other things along the way that I feel like made him overall better as the show went along. But I still feel like there's a lot more room to improve with Ezra in the show, because he was almost a non-factor come the end, with him helping a little bit and then, you know, being one of the ones who's going to help to fight against Thrawn, and the only one who's actually able to even escape from that galaxy on his ship. But at the same time, you know, I do feel like maybe they could work a little bit harder with Ezra and his character. And of course, we do have the return also of Hayden Christensen one more time to the Star Wars franchise, and I think that he did a great job in this series as Anakin. The thing is that Hayden Christensen got so much hate for his portrayal as Anakin back in the prequels, but the thing is, like, when you go back and rewatch them again, you can clearly see that he got better between episode 2 and 3, that he was still giving the performance that George Lucas wanted him to. At the end of the day, these are all the performances that George Lucas looked at and directed and said, this is good, this is what I want. And not just that, but he's gotten that much better as an actor as he has progressed in age, to where when he's playing Anakin, he's given the best performance he probably ever has as Anakin nowadays, where not only is he playing Anakin post Return of the Jedi as kind of a Force embodiment, or the embodiment of the Force itself, or something like that. Not just that, but then we see him transitioning to the other Anakins, where he plays the Clone Wars Anakin on screen for the first time, and then he also plays and portrays how he was in Revenge of the Sith. So we get a lot of that from Hayden Christensen, and I think that he does a really good performance. However, after episode 5, there really isn't much that he does in the show that we could see on screen at the very least. And again, I feel like the show itself peaked in episode 5 and didn't quite live up to that for the rest of the season. Now, in terms of other cons, there are some mystery boxes that were set up in typical current Star Wars fashion that never really got any payoff at all. Like, for example, the Inquisitor Merrick, who himself wasn't a villain from Yu-Gi-Oh!, but was rather an Inquisitor who was one the typical villains that we saw throughout the course of Rebels. However, whereas in Rebels and the other shows, we've gotten a lot more backstory and insight into who the individuals are that are the Inquisitors themselves. In this show, that wasn't quite the case. And rather, Merrick just gets killed off unceremoniously by Ahsoka, and, you know, when he gets slashed through, a bunch of black smoke shoots out of his body, and that's the last we ever actually hear of the character. Was he resurrected from the dead by Morgan Ellsbeth, the Night Sister, or was he, you know, I don't know, just a smoke alien? You know, we have no idea because they never explained it to us. It's one of the many things that fans speculate on. Is this Starkiller? Is this actually Ezra who's evil or undercover? Well, we never got an explanation. We probably never will, except for in like a comic book or something that the vast majority of people watching the show will never actually see, which is definitely a disappointment. And I hope that all the things they set up in the show will have some sort of payoff, because otherwise it's going to be a huge disappointment, especially with regard to what they set up with the Children of Mortis come the end of the season. Additionally, in terms of Morgan Elsbeth herself, I think that she was like a solid kind of mini villain, but she basically just served as a means to an end to set up the things to come with Thrawn and everything else conveyed to this new galaxy in the new show, in the new franchise itself. Come the end of the show, she also just kind of gets killed off in like a disappointing way, because the fact of the matter is, like, she gets powered up by the Night Sisters, and she gets like a special like dark blade sword, and that comes from the Dathomir. And then what happens is she just gets cut down by Ahsoka, and for whatever reason, even though they resurrected a bunch of stormtroopers, they don't resurrect her. So unless they do that again in the next season, well, I guess her character is just kind of done now. And so that was a little disappointing in and of itself as well. And also with regard to the whole world between worlds aspect, I do kind of feel like maybe they could have used it even better. It was more of kind of like a background for what we saw in episode 5. You know, it was a massive thing that played out in the end of Rebels, especially during the whole confrontation between Ezra and Palpatine, Sidious at the time, and how it could have changed everything. A lot of people are speculating they're going to use Ahsoka to go in the world between worlds and time travel and retcon the sequel trilogy. Of course, none of that happened, and I highly doubt they're ever going to do that, but, you know, it certainly is a possibility, even though it's something they didn't even really touch on at all in this, and we didn't really get much more about the world between worlds. But again, who knows what they're necessarily setting up in the next season? Could it be the son of Mortis? Could it be Abeloth, the evil dark side entity? Well, we'll have to find that out. Another character I did really like was Wu Yan, who was played by David Tennant, the droid who used to train the Jedi, teach them how to build their lightsabers and everything like that. Thought he was one of the fun characters. And I did really like that kind of love letter moment to Star Wars, where he starts to tell Ahsoka stories of the past, the anthology of the universe or the galaxy, and then he begins with a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And that's one of the many things about this show that really separates it from Disney's sequel trilogy and a lot of what Disney has done since they've taken over, where you could tell, even if you don't like the things that Dave Filoni is doing, that he still does love and care for Star Wars. He still is following in the same vein as George Lucas, and this in many ways kind of is a love letter to the Star Wars that he had constructed in the past in Lucasfilm and then continuing over into the Disney regime. So overall, I do feel like that is one of the positive things here. In terms of the spirit of Star Wars, this show feels like a continuation of the real Star Wars, at least, you know, in live action animation, whereas Disney's other stuff feels more like bad fan fiction. So I think that in terms of that overall direction, they're going in the right way. So overall, with Ahsoka season 1, which I assume is going to be the first season because they set up so much that they pretty much need at least one more season to pay it off. And I know that there's rumors about the movie and about other things that are happening, but we'll have to wait and see if that's actually what plays out. With regard to Ahsoka season 1, I feel like it was still really good overall. It definitely had its cons, it definitely had its flaws. There were things that weren't quite as handled as excellently as they could have been, and the season finale didn't reach the heights of the season finale of Mandalorian season 2 or of episode 5 of this show, which might be the best thing that Disney Star Wars has ever done. But with that being said, guys, I do think that this is worth watching for Star Wars fans. It is something that seems like it's still taking things in the right direction, even though it might not be a 10 out of 10 series, and most of the The episodes don't even come close to that. But the fact of the matter is, when we look at stuff like the Clone Wars and other aspects like that, was that good from the start? I don't think so. It definitely took time for it to pick up and be as great as what we saw with like the Sons of Dathomir and, you know, a lot of the other storylines along the way. So I'm going to give this time as well. Overall, I enjoyed it. I could see myself rewatching this in the future, and I do think that this is way better than the Star Wars sequel trilogy and a lot of other stuff that Disney put out, despite the fact that that's not exactly a high bar to set. But what do you guys think? Let me know your own thoughts down below in the comments. Also, make sure to subscribe if you're new here. Enable all notifications, leave your own thoughts down below like I just said, so doubly do it, and make sure to stick around because there's a lot more to come in the future.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.